Ave Maris Stella.
Hello, this is post-production Father Matthew. Just giving you a little message beforehand. This is a patron questions episode. So those who are Patron patrons of either SQPN or myself get to ask questions. If you want to ask a question, please join one of the two patrons. That would be patreon.com/FRMatthewLC for myself and patreon.com/SQPN for StarQuest. And if you support either of those, you'll get a message on there when we finish a part where I'm going to allow asking questions, and you can ask your questions and get them answered. Now let's go to the recording. Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Church of Christ, and I teach theology. This is a podcast on StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today, we are doing the first Q&A episode. It's not a numbered episode. It's just going to be like Q&A 1. And this was the questions were on either Sacrosanctum Concilium or the podcast in general, things like that. Nobody really asked the podcast in general questions, so all three of the questions we got are on Sacrosanctum Concilium. I've done this another few times this year, maybe about half a dozen times total. So a little more spread out, like every 2 months, not like this. And this is patron questions. So you have to be a patron on Patreon of either SQPN or myself, which is patreon.com/FRMatthewLC for myself and patreon.com/SQPN for StarQuest. You can do it at any level. So even if you're just a low-level donor, like $2 a month, you still can ask questions if you want to ask questions for later on. There were 3 questions today, one from mine, 2 from SQPN's Patreon, and the first 2 are kind of related. They're on the question of the text versus the spirit of Sacrosanctum Concilium. There is a whole debate about the spirit of Vatican II versus the text of Vatican II, which I think I mainly focus on the text, but you probably heard some things of the spirit where you're like, what we read doesn't really match what I was told. And that's often the spirit of Vatican II. And these 2 questions about it in the liturgy. I want to read both questions, and then I want to answer the questions after I read both. So we're going to read them. They are from CM first and then TM. So CM says, "Hi, Father. I would love to hear your thoughts on the gap between the broad ideas about liturgical form that are outlined in Sacrosanctum Concilium and the execution of those ideas. I was struck by the thought that Sacrosanctum Concilium calls for reforms like the use of vernacular in the liturgy, but also unabashedly calls for maintaining the use of Latin and chant in the Mass, which all but disappeared in a lot of places after Vatican II. How can we better incorporate tradition to be closer to the ideas of the Council Fathers outlined in Sacrosanctum Concilium?" There's a typo in there, obviously, because she has some word wrong. And I think that there are some things. Let me just read TM, and then we'll get to the question by TM, and I'll kind of answer both together because they're kind of related. So TM says, based on the document, it seems like the intent was to have limited change of liturgy, more like making corrections, improvements, rather than a complete overhaul. It seems like the creation of the Novus Ordo liturgy went far beyond the scope of this document. Would you agree? I don't mean this as a loaded question, although this can be a minefield. I'm genuinely curious what your opinion on having studied the document so thoroughly. So those are the questions. I think for the most part, we have to look at the actual changes and how much like the Novus Ordo matches the document, the Novus Ordo ordinary form. That'd be the Mass that 99% of Catholics in the U.S. go to on an average Sunday. About 0.5% go to an Eastern Rite, and 0.5% go to extraordinary form of Latin Mass is the best estimate I've seen around. You can go to my website. There's actually, I did the math for the one on extraordinary form on my website. Anyways, so 99% of Catholics go to that one on this average Sunday. Who go to Mass, that one on an average Sunday. And so overall, I think for the most part, the actual text of the ordinary form generally matches Sacrosanctum Concilium. And there are some changes which weren't necessarily obligatory, and I'm kind of indifferent to. But then I think the spirit really didn't match what the text of Sacrosanctum Concilium did, or even the text of the Novus Ordo, the ordinary form, as is written with the the general instruction of the Roman Missal, which gives the instructions for celebrating Mass. So the one thing I might have kept if I was on the commission, I would have almost definitely kept where I was on the commission. So before Vatican II, there was an octave after Pentecost. So after Christmas and Easter, there's like a whole octave. We celebrate those feast days for a whole week, basically. Octave meaning 8 days. And so, like Easter, it's a solemnity every single day of Easter week. For Christmas, it's not a solemnity, but it's still an important feast days all that whole week until Mary, until January 1st, which is Mary, Queen of Heaven and Earth, I think is what it is. Anyway, so I definitely would have kept that. I know that's kind of a minor thing, but I would definitely have kept that as what's in charge. And then I'm indifferent on a lot of things that could or could not have been changed. Like the offertory changed quite significantly. If you read the prayers, like the priest says, "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation, for through your goodness we have received the bread we offer you." Those prayers, which the priest will often say silently as you're singing the hymn at the offertory, those prayers changed significantly since Vatican with the ordinary form. And both seem good. I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other. And then another thing was that before you had two sets of what we now call ordinary time. There was Epiphany to Ash Wednesday, and then there was Pentecost to the first Sunday of Advent, which are two separate groups of times and readings. And there are a few weeks now that can either be before or after Lent and Easter. I don't really think that's a big deal. It's a slight difference. To me, it's not the hugest deal. And I could really go either way. And then the idea of the ordination of the priest. So before Vatican II, the very strong norm was that you would have an altar against the wall and the priest would have his back to the people face the altar on the wall. And now the more standard way is to face the people with an altar freestanding in the middle. The ad orientem is facing the altar with facing the same way as the people, and the versus populum is the term for facing the people. I have celebrated Mass both ways in ordinary form, and I think it's perfectly fine to celebrate ad orientem. Or ordinary form allows it. I think there might be a good idea to have a little more of that, not to have like every single Mass necessarily, because I think there can be the ordinary form allows for quite a bit more distinction than the extraordinary form does, where it's very, very strict what you must do comparatively. And then getting on to the spirit, there's a huge difference in the spirit, right? Like I've heard people say, the Vatican II says get all the Latin out of Mass. No, it doesn't. It explicitly says, hey, we should have a lot of it still in. We should have the Latin. We should have a lot of it in Latin, especially the stuff that's repeated every Sunday. Because if every Sunday you say the same prayer, you can understand what that means, even if you're not saying in English, even if you don't really know Latin. It takes you just like, Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, that's Lamb of God, takes away the sins of the world. That which is the prayer right before communion. If you say that every Sunday, you need to explain it once or twice, and you remember it, and you can. And the Latin, I think, speaks to the universality of the church, and that the whole church and the whole world is saying it the same. And I think that's good. I think that those type of things, like the Gloria, glory to God in the highest, that Agnus Dei, the Pater Noster, the Our Father, and even sometimes the Eucharistic prayer would be good to fit into this vision. My own community, we do a lot of this in our own Masses. And then in the seminary, we would celebrate Novus Ordo or ordinary form in Latin twice a week, usually about twice a week. Related to this also, I think, is a lot of it is the way Mass is celebrated, not so much the actual text. Because I wonder how many people how much more, if you had a super reverent celebration, it would, we could have a lot more unity versus like some of the kind of interesting Masses I've been to in my life, not as a priest really, but when I was a brother, I was traveling a little bit. It's not, you just go to whatever parish, and sometimes it was like, Or I was teaching catechism and we had a Mass at the parish one time, and I was like, is that really feeding these people spiritually? Like, yes, the Mass was valid, but it wasn't really the kind of, the kind of devotion and things like that was not really clear. And so I think a lot of these things can bring it back. And I think there is a good thing to have to look at a little more Latin, a little more, and a lot more devotion, I think, in how we celebrate. Some even do ad orientem Masses. So the third question was by CE. And so this one is a question on Easter as a fixed date, which is on the appendix. So I'm going to read the question, then I'm going to read the actual appendix that they're talking about, because I didn't read it in the podcast because I didn't think it was like super important, but it is worth mentioning if you're interested enough to listen to the Q&A episode. So let's read the question and then the appendix. My question is on the appendix of Sacrosanctum Concilium, the one part you did not read. This is regarding Easter and the possibility of it becoming a set date, creating a fixed liturgical calendar. Was this addressed after the council? But we ever see Easter being a fixed date? Wondering why you did not read the appendix. Thanks. So in general, I just didn't read the appendix. I didn't think it was that important. And one of the things I think is, at least this question, was something that was important at the time that's kind of fallen to the wayside a lot. But let's read the appendix now. The Second Ecumenical Sacred Council of the Vatican recognized the importance of the wishes expressed by many concerning the assignment of the Feast of Easter to a fixed Sunday and concerning an unchanging calendar, have carefully considered the efforts which could result from the introduction of a new calendar, declares as follows. 1. The Sacred Council would not object to if the Feast of Easter were assigned to a particular Sunday of the Gregorian calendar, provided that those whom it may concern, especially the brethren who are not in communion with the Apostolic See, give their assent. 2. The Sacred Council likewise declares that it does not oppose the efforts designed to introduce a perpetual calendar into civil society. So those are the 2 points. But among the various systems which are being suggested to stabilize the perpetual calendar introduced into civil life, the Church has no objections, only in the case those systems retain a safeguard, a 7-day week with Sunday, without the introduction of any days outside the week, so that the succession of weeks may be left intact. Unless there is question of the most serious reasons concerning the Apostolic See shall judge. So there's 2 parts here, the idea of Easter and then the idea of like the 7-day week, which I think is important. So one of the things about Easter is linked to Pentecost, right? I mean, to Passover, not Pentecost. That's the Passover meals, the Last Supper, things like that. There can be if the Passover meal is Last Supper or the Passover was the Good Friday, but it definitely is Passover time. And so the months for the Jews are on the new moon. So like when there's no moon in the sky, right? And that's the new month. And so the 14th, because a lunar calendar is 28, a lunar month is 28 days. The 14th is the full moon, right? So the idea is having it on the full moon is very valuable. So it's the 14th of Nisan was Passover, and having that on the full moon is possible. Another thing that's noted is that they wanted to make it with the Orthodox. I think having a combined date with Easter with the Orthodox is valuable. And there's actually a movement to do that right now between Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople, or modern-day Istanbul, and Pope Francis. And I hope that will continue on, even if they, when they both pass away, because they both are getting elderly. Pray for them. But I don't think a set date like Easter is always the first Sunday of April, or Easter is always the 12th Sunday after Christmas, something like that, is really that helpful, because it really breaks it from the lunar cycle, which is Passover, which is important. And I think that would not be good. And I think that this idea of having a fixed date of Easter, as far as like the first Sunday of April, or the 12th, 13th Sunday after Christmas, has kind of fallen by the wayside. It's not really a super popular idea right now. It might make scheduling a civil calendar a little bit easier, but honestly, right now, we can calculate the date of Easter for like 3000 AD. So we don't need, it's not like it's kind of all confusing, right? Even though it does change back and forth a little bit over a few weeks of the year between, late March and mid-April, those type of things. So that's it. And then, here it mentions we have to keep the 7-day week, right? Because these are some other proposals that have gone around a little more, I've heard, having like, because if you had, say, like a 52-week year, so like the first of January is always like a Monday, you'd have like one extra day, because 364, I think, is the multiple of 7, not 365. And it's going against these ideas. Say, no, we need these 7 days, right? Because the 7 days goes back to creation, back to Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection. And so that 7-day cycle is important. And, and such. So I don't think that there's as strong a pull now as there was then to do those kind of calendars. There is some discussion of such calendars from time to time, but it's not a huge deal. So hopefully that's helpful. Thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a year, and thank you for the patrons for supporting and giving such good questions. This is a listener-supported podcast. You can donate to help StarQuest produce it. Another great podcast at sqpn.give. You can give one-time, monthly, or join the StarQuest Patreon. I do this on a volunteer basis. You can also join my Patreon, which supports my local religious community at patreon.com/frmatthewlc. I'm not sure when I'll do another one of these, but I'll spread out as every 2-ish months, so we do half a dozen over the year. And I'll probably put this out for non-patrons about 2 weeks after I put it on Patreon on both Patrons. Like always, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information on the podcast, such as playlists for individual documents and a reading plan.
Amen.